Okay. Good morning to all. I know we had a lot of people out last week, so I'm going to kind of back up just a little bit so we're not totally lost, which is why I'm redrawing this chart out here. I'll do a little bit more in a second. Last week we finished 2 Kings chapter 10. We saw kind of the end of all the things Jehu had done, destroying the house of Ahab, destroying the Baal worship in Israel. All good stuff until you get to the end of that chapter and it talks about how he still followed after the idolatrous ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which is a description we see of just about every king of Israel, is that for whatever reason is a thing that persists from generation to generation, from family to family. They still follow in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. And usually this is specific to the worship of the golden calves that were set up at Bethel and Dan in Israel so that people wouldn't go down to Jerusalem to worship, because Jeroboam had feared, if they go back down to Jerusalem, their heart is going to be with Rehoboam again. They're going to turn back to him, and I'm going to be out of a job, and I'm probably going to be dead. That's usually how that works in monarchies. So that was the sad just thing that Jehu missed. He did all those great things. So he said, come see my zeal for the Lord. But it only goes so far. And he's not really seen in a great light after that point from basically 29 on in 2 Kings 10. We had started 2 Kings chapter 11. We didn't get very far. And I kind of want to review some of the things that we talked about there anyways. So I'm actually going to have a start at the beginning of chapter 11. And we're going to kind of talk about how we got into this situation again. And those of you who were here last week, sorry, this is maybe a review. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't, but I want to make sure everyone's caught up because we had several people out last week. So someone please read for us 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, please. 1 through 3. Okay, so I guess a few things we need to check my spelling here. You might notice a few other things. So going back to chapter 10, just real quick, we had Ahab's household. We had Joram, who was in charge at the time when Jehu overthrows the house of Ahab. So what had happened was when Ahab died, so Ahab was the son of Omri, so Omri died, Ahab became king. When Ahab dies, his oldest son Amaziah becomes king. Remember at the very beginning of 2 Kings chapter 1, he dies in an accident. It's seemingly very random. I think the Lord's hand was in that. So he didn't have any descendants. He didn't have any sons to take the throne. So his younger brother Joram takes the throne. Joram is the one who is basically in charge of Israel from that point until chapter 10, when Jehu kills him off. And we talked about Jehu and his descendants. God promised him, I think it was in verse 30 of the last chapter, that because he had destroyed the house of Ahab like God had told him to, he was going to have his descendants promise the throne of Israel to the fourth generation. And I didn't draw all those out like I did last week because that's not really a point I need to get into because we're kind of past that point. But if any of you remember, you get to the fourth generation, Zechariah, his fourth generation down, he's on the throne for 6 months, and then he's assassinated, and then another family takes over the throne. So that comes to fruition, very much so. But we're done with Jehu. I don't want to get back in that territory. But anyway, there's one person still left of the house of Ahab that, because they were not in Israel, was not destroyed by Jehu. Because Jehu also, remember, killed Jezebel when he went to Jezreel. So he killed both Joram just outside of Jezreel. When he gets into Jezreel, he kills Jezebel, destroys every one of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, then goes down to Samaria, wipes out the rest, wipes out the prophets of Baal. So probably the king of Sidon was dead by that point too. Probably a different king in there. We don't know much about him. We don't even get a name. But we still have Judah we haven't talked about, and that's where we get into Judah for the next couple chapters here, starting in chapter 11. Now, I want to go back a little bit to talk about Jehoshaphat. We've talked about him mostly in 1 Kings, but also a little bit in 2 Kings. He was relatively a good king. All things speaking, if we go to the Chronicles, it actually gives more details about his reign. We only get kind of bits and pieces about it in the Kings, but because we're using Kings as kind of our focus here, I didn't want to get too hung up on Jehoshaphat, but relatively good king. In fact, there's this point where he and Joram, because they're allies, they're in the desert, and they're trying to go quash the Moabite rebellion, and they're having these issues with water, however they mess that up. But Elisha is there, and he goes to meet with him, and he tells Joram, I wouldn't even be talking to you guys if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat being here. So Jehoshaphat is considered a good king in the eyes of the Lord. He had his own issues, though. He was not perfect by any means. None of them were. So even though he was a relatively good king, one of his biggest faults was seeking this alliance with the house of Ahab, and that was done by his son, Jehoram, marrying Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab. Sometimes she's called the granddaughter of Omri. We're talking about the same person here. She was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, who married into the house of Jehoshaphat, married Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram. So, of course, when all this is going down with Jehu, she's in Judah. She's not in Israel. So when Jehoshaphat dies, Jehoram becomes king, and he has several sons. When he dies, his youngest son, Ahaziah, becomes king. Not the same as the Ahaziah over here, different one. But the reason that Ahaziah becomes king is all the other sons were taken away. We mentioned in Chronicles, it talks about the bit where the Philistine and Arab raiders came in, and they took away all the goods and the people in the house of Joram, including his sons. The only one that was left was Ahaziah. That's the only reason he comes to the throne. Otherwise, he probably would not have. So he is the one on the throne when Joram dies. Now, Ahaziah, remember, is also one who is killed during Jehu's destruction of the family of Ahab, because he happens to be there. He was visiting Joram, who had been wounded and was recovering at Jezreel because they had gone and fought the Arameans. Anyway, they're both in Jezreel. And so when Jehu comes in to start all his cleaning house, I guess, if you will, he is also there. And so when Jehu kills Joram, he sees Amaziah and is like, hey, let's kill him too. They do. So he dies. And so now we get to kind of what we've read here at the beginning of chapter 11, when you see verse 1, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. And that's speaking of the royal family of Judah here. So Ahaziah is dead because Jehu kills him as well. So there's this power vacuum. Now, what should have happened is the oldest son of Ahaziah should have become king. That would have been the thing to do, is you install the next in line. But remember, this is the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab, and the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab, like her parents, is not going to pass up an opportunity to see some power when it's available. Now, we don't know exactly how old his sons were. We don't get really any detail about them, but they seem to not be in control of what the situation is. For whatever reason, Athaliah has got allies who are willing to go with her to do the worst of things, which is to basically destroy people who should be on the throne. So she goes and she kills all of the other ones who would be in line. Now, that could also include brothers of Ahaziah. I haven't marked that on the chart. It may be that he had other brothers, but as far as we know, they were probably all gone after that invasion by the Philistines and Arab raiders. As far as I understand, he was the only one left. So it seems like it's talking about all his descendants. The only one that gets away is Joash, because Jehosheba, his aunt, basically, the daughter of Jehoram, the sister of Ahaziah, takes him and his nurse and hides them in the temple of the Lord, in essence. So she would have been successful, except for Joash gets away. And we'll talk about maybe how that exactly went down, and we get details at the end of the chapter that may help us understand that a little bit more. So with presumably all of the heirs to the throne of Judah dead, Athaliah takes the throne of Judah. because there's nobody else, in essence. So this is a really bad situation here. Not only is this the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab, now on the throne in Judah, but she's also technically a granddaughter of the king of Sidon. This is an important detail because we're going to come back to this later. What was Sidon known for importing to Israel? No, I'm thinking less material and more ideological. Baal worship is what I'm going to go with, if you all are okay with that answer. One of the things we see that Ahab did during his reign was he built a temple to Baal in Samaria. I wonder if that has anything to do with his wife. Baal was a Sidonian deity. There seems to be no coincidence there about that. We're going to talk about that probably a little bit more as we go through this chapter. So Athaliah is on the throne of Judah. Joash is in hiding, and he's hiding in the temple of the Lord. I want to talk about Jehoiada just real quick, because we don't get this detail in Kings, but in the Chronicles, it talks about how Jehoiada the priest was actually the husband of Jehoshaphat. So she has someone on the inside of the temple to help facilitate these things. Jehoiada is going to be a very important person in this chapter. We'll talk about it as we go. But that's how we get here. And I've always talked about how, don't worry, it gets worse in Judah. We're at the worst. We're here now. This is probably one of the lowest points in Judah's history. Obviously not the lowest, but it's up there as far as rankings go, if you will. Common questions about how we got here, what's going on up through verse 3. I hope I've covered this extensively enough. I want everyone to be caught up. Sorry for those of you here last week and already knew all this. So it's important. Go ahead, Bethany. I don't have an answer for you except for this is the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab, and that's about as much information as I need as far as character goes. She has no issue with it, apparently. For her motive, I think it's a power grab. She would be the queen mother, in essence. That would be, a considerable position. You'd be sort of a regent and an advisor in the royal court, but you're not the guy. You're not the one in charge. I kind of just assumed that she wanted to be the one. She wanted to be the one with the power. It's really sad that she's going to do that, but also it's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. This seems par for the course as far as that family goes. It's probably better to describe her less as the wife of Jehoram and better as the daughter of Ahab. That seems to be kind of there. And we don't get a lot of details. Even 2 Chronicles doesn't give us that much information about her motive specifically, but that seems to be the goal. Otherwise, she wouldn't be going through all this trouble. But yeah, there you go. All right, let's move on then, if we're all up to where we're at. So I'm going to read for us verses 4 through 12, please. 4 through 12. Okay. So, a lot of stuff happening here. We'll talk about it. One thing you will note is we get really no details at all about Athaliah's reign here. Second Chronicles doesn't really expound on it any further either. And we would wonder why that is. Like, that's a long time for nothing to happen. But stuff did happen. We'll get some clues about it toward the end of this chapter. But I'll probably say the reason this is not recorded in very much detail is because she's probably not very well liked. We're going to have some hints about that as well. And in ancient times, one of the things, if you wanted to kind of insult those who were not popular in their time, was just kind of erase a lot of their history. Don't really say anything they did. I mean, that was kind of a bigger insult than recording all the bad things they did. So we don't get really any information, but we'll get some clues toward the end of the chapter, and we'll talk about them then. But we see here in verse 4, the 7th year here, so Athaliah has been reigning for 6 years. Now, in the 7th year, this is all going to change. Now, we talked about Jehoiada, the priest. He's taken a huge position here. He's doing all the work, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more as we get later on. But he's got this plan. He says, it's time to act, it's time to organize, and it's time to get rid of Athaliah. We need to restore Joash, who is a descendant of David, the one who should be on the throne, to the throne of Judah. Now, first he summons a bunch of soldiers. The soldiers, depending on your translation, I want to talk about it for just a little bit, even though it's probably a very minor detail. Some of these seem specific soldiers to those who would guard the king, who would guard royalty. Now, some translations, your verse 4 is going to be a little different. So like verse 4, in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent for the commanders of units of 100, the captains and the guards. Some translations will say the Karites and the guards. So depending on the translations you're using, if you're using like NIV, something like that, it'll say Karites. Like I'm thinking it's King James will use the term captains. There is a specific reason why sometimes Karites is used here instead of captains. I had to look this up because I didn't know it off the top of my head. These, regardless of what the translation is, the Hebrew word there is Kari, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but it's a term to identify the people that were foreign-born, that were bodyguards to the king, basically. And this would be kind of like the Kerethites and the Perethites that were served as the foreign mercenary guards for King David during his time. They're mentioned several times in Scripture together. Some scholars believe that this is sort of an offshoot of that. Kerethites may be this as well. Some non-Hebrews who are in charge of protecting the king, and you might wonder, well, why would they have non-Hebrews protecting the king? This was actually a very common practice to do, because if you're guarding the king, like you have all access to the king, he's kind of at your mercy, and if you have some sort of incentive to get rid of him, then you might be more likely to do that. So a lot of times you would have foreign guards protect the king because, if they betray the king in some way, they're not going to get a promotion. It's not like they're going to, succeed to the throne or have anybody who will raise them up in their station. That's where they are. That's their spot in life. I kind of think of the Ottoman Janissaries as sort of a very famous example of that. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up. They basically would take and enslave Southern Europeans, take them to the Ottoman Empire. They would train them as children, and then they would serve the king for their most of their adult life. It was a very common practice among many cultures. So if that seems a weird thing to you, it's not, I promise. There are many examples of it in history. So we don't know exactly who they are or where they came from. And again, your translations will vary a little bit, but recognize that these may not all be Hebrews here that are being discussed. Now, all of these soldiers, commanders that had gathered, they were placed under oath, and we're not given details of that, but probably it's like an oath to do what you're supposed to do and don't reveal what's about to happen to anyone else. I imagine that's kind of what we're talking about here. Because what he does, Jehoiada reveals, hey, look, here's Joash. Here's the one who's actually supposed to be king. Let me show him to you. And, if they're following their job, they're supposed to protect him because he's the rightful heir to the throne. And so he explains to them, like, we've got this plan, and it's going to play out during it's described to me kind of like the changing of the guard, right? So you can't have guys on guard 24/7. They've got to take their break at some point. So it seems like for those who are about to go off duty and those who are about to come on duty, instead of doing that, we're going to do something else. So we're going to have double the amount of people, basically. This is a thing that would usually not happen because you want your guys to get rest, and if you have them all doing one thing at a certain shift change, well, it better be important, and I think it is. This is Jehoiada's plan to make sure he's got enough guys behind him to make this, I guess if you want to call it a coup, he's going to make it happen. So they talk about this, the changing of the guard. You're all going to gather. You're going to be around the king. You're going to protect him wherever he goes. If anyone approaches you or tries to stop you, you kill him. Like, that's their orders. This is a no-nonsense kind of order. There's no exceptions. There's no, in case of this situation, do this. It is, here's your orders, very plain and simple. This is what's going to happen. This is the plan. And we see in starting in verse 9 that these soldiers, they do as they're commanded. Jehoiada arms them specifically with spears and shields of David that were in the temple. This seems like a weird thing, like, why do we have weapons in the temple? I mean, that's probably where a lot of their stockpile was. I don't think this is a weird thing or some oddity, if you will. This is something that would have been there on a constant basis. And then in verse 12, we see Jehoiada brings out Joash into full view, puts a crown on him, gives him a copy of the covenant, proclaims him as king, and Joash is anointed. The people, they're clapping and they're shouting and saying, "Long live the king." Everyone seems to be happy about this. This is a full public display. He's got his soldiers with him. The priest has anointed him king. Everyone's shouting. Everyone's being happy, except for one person, which we'll get to in the next verse. So that's what's going on here. Any thoughts, ideas, questions, comments? It's pretty straightforward. We're not getting into too deep of stuff. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, the legacy weapons, if you will. And there's some symbolism behind that. Is we're guarding the son of David, basically. This person that's on the throne is not a descendant of David. They have no right to this throne. Let's put the actual one on the throne. Yeah, so it seems coincidental in a way, but also, I mean, there were weapons in the temple. This was not a strange thing. We see details of that in other places too. So. Right, yeah, the palace guard would have probably had most of the other armory as well. Yeah, very good detail. Any other thoughts? Okay, we're going to push forward. Someone read for us 13 through 16, please. 13 through 16. Okay, so Athaliah is clearly not prepared for this moment. I don't know what she's been doing up to this point, but she's not expecting all of a sudden a descendant of David to just appear and be anointed king right under her nose. I mean, this is happening all in Jerusalem, so she's missed something here, but she hears what's going on. She hears the commotion. She goes to the temple, and when she gets there, she sees Joash. He's crowned. He's got all his get-up, his entourage, like he is royalty. He's there. Everyone seems to be behind him. And, they're rejoicing. They're blowing the horns. She tears her robes and cries out treason. Like, this is, I'm your ruler. You're trying to throw someone else up against me. Now, I want to talk about this notion of treason here. Typically, it would be treason to appoint another leader to replace a legitimate monarch. So, she's in charge, she's the monarch. Hey, you put somebody up here against me, that's treason. The key word, though, here is legitimate monarch. Athaliah is not a legitimate ruler here. Remember, she has made this power play. She's not a descendant of David. She should not be on this throne. So for her to kind of call out treason here is kind of comical in a way, because isn't that what she did to get here? This is, the pot calling the kettle black. I don't know what you want to call this, but this is hypocrisy at its finest. She's crying treason, even though she's the one that committed treason like 7 years ago here. So yeah, it seems a little bit funny if it wasn't so sad, because real people died in all this. But no one really comes to her side in any of this. We don't see anyone follow after her. No one else seems to be supporting her in any way. Again, I don't think she's very popular. This kind of reminds me of when Jehu is going through and destroying the house of Ahab. Everyone seems happy to join Jehu in destroying the house of Ahab. When the other commanders are with him at the camp, when he's first anointed king of Israel by someone they didn't really respect, somebody of the company of prophets, they didn't really care about the Lord. But when they heard Jehu was anointed king, they're like, oh yeah, we'll be behind you, Jehu. And then he goes out and he's approaching Jezreel, and the riders go out to meet him. And he says, what do you want? What peace? Forget about it. Fall in behind me. And they do. They just stay with him. He gets into Jezreel by that point. Jezebel's there with her eunuchs, and he tells the eunuchs, throw her down if you're with me. And they do. No questions asked. Everyone's happy to follow Jehu. I think maybe he was pretty well loved being in his position, but also probably the house of Ahab was not very popular at that point. Because a lot of bad things happened. We've talked about all the bad things Israel's gone through under that reign. So I wonder if a very similar thing is happening here. They take her out. They don't kill her at the temple, though. They're very careful about that. They didn't want to shed blood in the temple. They take her out. Basically, it seems to be an area near the royal stables is what's being described here. And they have her killed there. Again, no one else seems to be with her at this point. No one else seems to be following her or trying to support her. She is alone. She is killed alone, as far as the details we get here. And that's the end of her reign. That just comes to an end all of a sudden. Any thoughts, comments? Yes, sir.
I love the symbolism of taking her out through the horse's gate. If you don't know, if you're unsure of like the importance behind that, horses being stable animals, they drop dung whenever they want to. They have lots of flies around them. They don't really smell the best, right? Just like you have a garage in your house, right, where the car goes.
Yeah.
Come into the house, right? It's the same type of thing. It's kind of just a dirty place where they would bring the horses to and from, so that it wouldn't displease all of the people that lived in that area, right?
Yeah, she's not even killed in a place of honor.
No,
Yeah.
you're drug out for you're not even good enough to be taken out through the front door. You're taken out through the garage door and hacked off where basically the horses go to the bathroom.
Yeah, it seems fitting, I guess, in that way.
It's a very fitting thing for her very short appearance in the Bible.
Yeah. Arnold, you had a hand as well. Go ahead.
I believe that the reason they didn't really come to her rescue was sort of like you have a group of people around you for one thing or the other. So any opportunity to, I guess, change, groups, okay, whoever's on top.
Yeah.
This is who you follow.
No one's going to follow a loser.
No one's
Yeah.
gonna follow.
They'll follow you until it's not convenient for them anymore. Yeah, man. Do we see that in politics now? Oh, man, do we ever? Let's get on a happier note. Buddy, you had a comment too. Go ahead.
I just, it seems strange that it took 7 years for this to take place. And I probably twofold reasons. She came to power with such, killing everybody. No one willing to stand up against you. She must have had a lot of backing from some.
And it seemed very swift too. Maybe people didn't rally around because they didn't know what was going on. Yeah.
And I guess because of Joash's age or something, I don't know.
Yeah, we'll talk about his age in a little bit. And we don't know exactly why this is the time. Jehoiada has calculated this. He's calculated correctly. I mean, this works, yeah. So whatever is going on, whatever he's planning, whatever he's waiting for, he's done okay at that. I'm not going to criticize that at all. Yeah, absolutely. But we don't know why exactly they've waited till this point. It may be because they had to wait for any allies she had to kind of disperse or become displeased, kind of like Arnold was talking about, or the people at large should not be happy with her reign. We don't know, but there definitely would not be an uprising unless there is another legitimate heir to the throne. Without Joash living, what's going to happen? There's no one to replace Athaliah with, basically. So he has to appear at some point before any of this can go down. So Joash surviving is a very important point to that, probably the most critical piece. But we'll talk about the age thing when we get lower down, because it actually talks about his age a little bit, and we'll mention that more in detail. Jeff.
This is an example of might makes right. And while that is faulty reasoning, and we all understand that, but the idea behind it is that she ascended to the throne. God didn't stop her from ascending to the throne. Therefore, he must have been pleased, or at least accepted her as queen. And so in her mind, this is how we delude ourselves. In her mind, this changed the paradigm. She's now the ruler. And so to her, this really is treason. To her actions were not treason because God allowed it to happen. But she's not thinking straight because God's allowing this to happen.
Yeah.
So the reasoning is faulty. It's when we're selfish, when we're looking out for ourselves, we can become very delusional. And so she obviously is. And so we will meet people in life who kind of live by this anthem. If they can do something, they will, and they think they're right in doing it. And if you oppose them, you're wrong. And so it's absurd on its face, but we will run into that from time to time, and Christians have to kind of be prepared sometimes that we may have a period of time in which we suffer because of people like this. And the nation did suffer for a period of time in some way.
Yeah, and we have to be careful about falling into the philosophy of Thrasymachus, where we basically say, justice is the advantage of the stronger. If I can beat you up and take your lunch money, I have every right to do so. It's essentially what that boils down to. So, if I can kill the whole royal family of Judah and take the throne for myself, I have every right to do so, is kind of the notion of thinking. But then, when everyone turns against you, suddenly you're not a big fan of that idea anymore.
To kill those other royal heirs.
Yeah, it was not her probably doing it, yeah.
There were people who were helping her.
She had allies at that point, yeah. So, that can be a dangerous philosophy if we buy into that. That can be a whole rabbit hole in itself. I won't get too much into that, but I agree, yes. Any other comments? Okay. We might even finish this off. Great. Someone read for us 17 through 21. That'll be 17 through the end of the chapter, please.
I'm reading from the ESV.
All right.
And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king of the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. Then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke in pieces, and they killed after the priest of Baal before the altars. And the priest posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. And he took the captains, the Kerites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, marching through the gate of the guards to the king's house. And he took his seat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the king's house.
And then verse 21.
Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign.
Thank you. Okay, so kind of the verse 17 starting here, we see Jehoiada declaring covenants between the Lord, the people, the king. I think kind of this first one describing, the people being the Lord's reminds me a lot of the first part of Hosea, the prophet, where he kind of describes the Israelites as not being his people. They had gone away. They had basically committed idolatry in a sense with the idols. They committed adultery with the idols that they had begun to follow. Instead of serving the Lord, they were like an unfaithful wife. Their children were illegitimate children. They were not his people. And then God kind of talks about how, I'm going to get to this point where they will be my people again. They will follow after my ways. It's the great, really cool part of Hosea we won't get too far into, but it reminds me of that sort of thing. So he's making these covenants, making sure we're all together in this. We're all going to serve the Lord. We're all going to recognize that Joash is the legitimate king here who should be on the throne. We get to verse 18, I think is one of the most interesting verses here. We see the people of the land go and tear down the temple of Baal. They kill Mattan, the priest of Baal. Now, we have talked about temples of Baal before in this study. This is not the first time this has come up. Remember, Ahab had built a temple to Baal in Samaria. And, that seems to have been there until Jehu goes and tears it down in chapter 10. So what is this temple we're talking about here in Judah? Right? We haven't talked about a temple in Judah to Baal. Now, I kind of went through and to see, is there any temple of Baal mentioned before this? Not really. Not in Judah. Not like this. I assume, and this is me kind of making an assumption, so take it with whatever grains of salt you want to. I think Athaliah probably may have built this temple to Baal during her 6 years reigning over the land. That seems to be in character for her following in the paths of her parents. And remember, even Ahaziah here, when it's describing his reign earlier in 2 Kings, he's described as one who followed after the ways of the house of Ahab. They were on board with this Baal stuff, is what that tells me. So it would not surprise me if Athaliah is the one that built this temple to Baal, and then as kind of a completion of her downfall, they're destroying this temple that she built. Now this does two things. It washes away more of her influence, but it's also destroying more idolatry that's going on in Judah, which is not going to get wiped out completely, unfortunately. This is one of these lingering things. They never quite get rid of it all. That becomes the downfall of Judah as well as Israel. That's kind of the interesting thing here. I think this is not the temple of Baal in Samaria. I think this is another temple that Athaliah has built. We don't get really any details about it, but that seems to make the most sense to me. So that's kind of what I've gone through in my head as this happening. Verse 19, we see Joash. He takes his place on the throne in Judah. Verse 20, we see the people are happy that Athaliah has been disposed of. She's been slain. And in the final verse here, verse 21, it tells us that Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. I think this is, from this day onward, not, he was supposed to be on the throne. We're counting those years from when Ahaziah died. I think we're talking about Athaliah's dead. He's king now. The 7 years, that's when that's starting. That's when that's counting from. So he's 7 years old when he begins his reign. So with that detail, a number of things have to be true. This may be just a detail to you, but this is kind of important to think about. This would mean that Joash is only maybe about a year old when the royal family is destroyed, so give or take a little bit. Maybe this is why he flies under the radar as far as, Athaliah going through, and she would probably be as thorough as possible, making sure that there's no other heirs that could take her place. Maybe he slipped under the radar because maybe he was just barely alive, maybe hadn't been on the earth for that long. We don't really know exactly how she would have missed that, but that may be part of the reason. Or may think, it's just a baby, he'll never come back, and even if he grows up, how's he going to know who he is? We can make a lot of assumptions about that, but that might be a contributing factor. This would also mean that Joash has lived the majority of his life in the temple of the Lord. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. We don't know exactly what he's seen or heard. He's probably been hidden most of this time, very little access to the outside world, but the place he is at is the temple of the Lord. And I wonder if maybe there's some influence that he's going to get from that at a very young age. We'll talk about that as we go through through chapter 12. You can just kind of remember that and think about that as we go through chapter 12 starting next week. And then the third thing is that Joash probably had very little agency in any of this happening. I don't see Joash being in on these meetings with Jehoiada about how we're going to get the throne back and all these plans for how we're going to get the guards to help us and get rid of. I don't think he is really a player in this. I think he's kind of the football that everyone's carrying along the way, and Jehoiada is the quarterback making sure he gets to the end zone, if you can forgive the analogy there. He is not the grand master here. Joash is not the planner. He's not. He can't really do anything for himself. He's still 7 years old. He's just a child. He can't really do anything without someone else helping him. Jehoiada is really the power behind that, who's making all these things happen. He's going to be a big influence on Joash's life. We'll continue to talk about that as we go forward in the study. So, you know, he's really the ones making this happen. But I don't get any sense that he's got some sort of ulterior motive, that he wants power for reals. He's trying to restore Judah to what it should be. Any comments, questions? We're kind of out of time, but we'll stop here. Okay, so this seems to be almost kind of an aside as far as our overall study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha, but this is happening, as far as we can tell, during Elisha's toward the end of Elisha's life. So next week we will begin in chapter 12, and I plan to go through chapter 13 to end this study. So we're just a couple chapters away from the end. If you haven't already, go ahead and read chapter 12 and chapter 13. We'll go through those, and then that's when we'll stop. When we get to the end of chapter 13, depending on how this lands in timing, I'm not sure how that's going to work out yet. I never really do. I do want to do a little bit of overview, kind of looking at the time period of, you know, we've looked at the start, even before Elijah comes onto the scene, and we've seen it play out, and how we get to the end of Elisha's life. And I want to ask some questions about their influence, the work they've done, how it changes history, if you will, in a way, or how it influences history, and why any of that matters and why it's important. Because I think, you know, we can read through all this stuff and it sounds great and it's fantastical and it's great history, but like, why is it important? Why is this history important to us today? Why are Elijah and Elisha such critical players in all of these things that are happening, even when they're not on the scene every moment? What are they doing in the background? How does their work change what happens going forward? So I think that's some good questions we need to ask before we fully close the study. But after we do that, the plan will be to move on to study the genealogy of Jesus. So Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 3 will be kind of the starting points for that. I kind of know how I want to approach it now. I've been avoiding the study for a while just because I didn't know how I wanted to present it yet, but now I do. So we're going to go ahead and do that once we're done with the study. So probably somewhere in early spring, we'll be switching gears, but we're almost done with the study. We got 2 more chapters, and then we'll be done. So I appreciate your comments, and we'll move on to chapter 12 next week.